And so I want to be addicted to truth. That's why I love your program. That's why I love what you stand for.
Thanks. Okay, so we have the evidence that the carbon dating now, we have done again, and it's right?
So we have not carbon dated it. We have actually other ways in which we have
better.
This
now,
is
right?
breaking news.
Okay.
We have something called waxis dating, wide angle X-ray scattering, and this is really fun. You know how I mentioned that we have other burial shrouds of Jesus from the land of Israel?
Right.
So there's a lab in Italy that has a burial shroud that we know is from Masada. And you've been to Israel. You know all about Masada, the last stand against Titus. So we have this. We know the date is sound, AD 70 or so, right? And so they have that shroud sampling. And then they took a sample, a correct sample of the shroud, and they compared that using wide-angle X-ray scattering. And they see that there has been 2,000 years of degradation in the shroud fibrils of this fine linen garment, meaning it has been getting old for 2,000 years, not 700. Think about that variation. And some skeptics will say, well, Jeremiah and Glenn, you know, this is a shroud. This is like a linen. I mean, I have linen. Are you telling me it will last 2,000 years? Yes. We actually have much older linen garments. You can, again, look at the Tarkan dress, which is a beautiful blouse that's fine linen. And it's 3,000 years older than the Shroud of Turin, Glenn. So it's a very stable material given the right circumstances. And again, when Jesus rises from the dead, everything changes in the mind of the first Jews. And so why would they discard this?
Okay, so talk about the blood stains
on
it.
And this is so important with you as an artist. How would you know how to forge this? So Alan Adler and other hematologists who are, again, these are experts in the blood, have taken blood samples. And if we had an ultraviolet light right now, that'd be a lot of fun, Glenn, because I could show you that the shroud, the number one substance on the shroud is blood. There are pints and pints and pints of blood all over the shroud. There's blood, there's 50 abrasions. We'll get to the crown of thorns on the forehead. 372 lacerations from a Roman whip called a flagrum, the flagellation of Jesus. So there's blood everywhere. They test the blood. And again, if you're a forger, you're just going to use animal blood, right? And the blood comes back human blood. Guess what the blood type is?
Hey everyone, if you're looking to build a daily habit of prayer and find more peace in your life.
Type AB. Forger, you're just going to use animal blood, right? And the blood comes back human blood. Guess what the blood type is? Type AB. Less than 3% of the world's population has type AB blood, and it is found primarily in the land of Israel. And it's male blood. They've tested the chromosomes. Some people are like, well, could we take the blood and, you know, clone Jesus? No, we don't. That can't be done.
I don't recommend that experiment anyway.
But it just shows, again, the scriptures say, fully God, fully man. And we see that evidence in the blood. Now, the interesting thing is, when we were walking through it, the lance wound in the side is right there in the Shroud of Turin. We'll talk about this in the way that Jesus died in excruciating fashion. When they look at that blood, they tested, and that is post-mortem blood. He was already dead. That blood is tested differently than the blood on the rest of the shroud, and that is consistent. Pilate is shocked based on the historical record that Jesus had died so quickly. Jesus dies in 6 hours, which shows you the particular brutality that he went through in the scourging and also beating in the house of Caiaphas, etc. And yet we know, based on the blood samples, that this is post-mortem blood. So again, if you're going to fake the shroud, you've got to kill a guy. His blood needs to be post-mortem blood, and then you need to slap that on the spear wound.
That's nuts.
Exactly. It takes.
And no one would have thought 700 years ago.
Right.
So how do you explain, or can we explain? I've always thought of the shroud, because it's a negative, as he is resurrected, it's just like a flash of light, of energy, that just imprints on this.
Yes.
Is there another explanation for this?
Again, another scientist, another school is given 5 years to study this. Just the amount of electromagnetic energy or even radiation it would take to produce an image on a shroud like this. But the fascinating thing is the timing. because when they sample it, it takes a lot of time to get the image on the shroud, but then the shroud would burn up almost instantaneously. So we know the image of the shroud based on 5 years of study on light. And again, you can read all this. It's fascinating. We know that it happened in 1/40th of a billionth of a second.
Oh my gosh.
1/40th billionth of a second. And it took 34,000 trillion watts of energy emanating from the body in a flash of 1/40th of a billionth of a second to produce that image. So in other words, God took the first selfie.
Wow. And at that, it left an imprint.
That is the moment
it would have been
of Jesus' physical, bodily resurrection, Sunday morning, April 5th, AD 33. It's at that moment. And then it's the fall-through theory that the sheet, essentially the body flashes alive and the sheet falls through, and Jesus is up. He's walking physically.
So they have checked for all other kinds of paint and everything
Pigment.
else. And go ahead.
You would appreciate this as an artist. When you look at the findings of the STIRP team, after 3 years, they did their research over 5 days, 1978. They took 3 years to publish their findings. I mean, this was very well organized. We'll talk about the 3D encoding in the image as well from the VP8 analyzer. We'll talk about that. That's fascinating. But when the STIRP team came out and they published their findings, they said, we cannot explain it. And listen carefully, no pigment, no dye, no paint, no oxidization from old paint, nothing. Barry Schwartz and all of the, and again, these are not theologians, Glenn.
Right,
I can't
I
make
know.
this more clear. These are people from Sandia Labs, the Air Force Academy, physics professors. They went in and were having drinks in the lobby joking about, I remember it was John Jackson who said, give me 15 minutes with the shroud and the scientific method and I'll prove it's a hoax. And he died, he's become the great defender of the shroud in all of his publications. And so no pigment, no dye, no paint. The best scientists from the jet propulsion labs cannot tell us how there's an image in that cloth. And it's superficial. This is the fascinating thing. And it took me a while in my research to really, truly appreciate this. The image is razor thin. The blood, when we were walking through the shroud, we can see the blood everywhere. The blood saturates the linen. And there's around 70 to 150 fibers in a single linen thread, okay? The image is only on 2 to 3 of those fibers superficially. So it doesn't go all the way through. The image doesn't go all the way through. It's there superficially. And it's inside 2 to 3 of these fibers that make up the single thread of the weave.
Wow. And then the blood goes through all of it.
Soaks through all of it. So the blood came first. We know that. Jesus is there. He's wrapped. His body is bloodied. And again, in Jewish burial traditions, when someone died, you buried them that day before nightfall. Remember, they're wanting to bury him before Passover. The Sabbath is coming. They have to quickly bury him. They quickly ask Pilate for the body of Jesus. He's wrapped, and yet there's no decomposition on the body either. And you ask, and here we have this beautiful replica of the crucified man of the shroud. And you say, Jeremiah, why does it look like his knees are bent and his head is on like on a pillow? Well, his body is in a state of rigor mortis. We know rigor mortis lasts 40 hours, some say longer. Based on my scholarship, Jesus is in the tomb no more than 39 hours.
So he is stiff, and
hard.
And hard.
Yep.
And then the body starts to relax after 40 hours?
After 40 hours, but they're, and not just to relax, that's when bodily fluids begin to break down.
Yeah, okay. So we know that his legs were up because you don't see the back of his knees.
Yep, you only see the right side more clearly than the left. And again, not a single bone on his body is broken. And again, that goes against Roman crucifixion. Most of the time,
Broke the legs.
they would break the shins. They would start there. And we also notice when you look at this that his body is in the shape, his arms are elongated. I don't know if you picked up on that with your artist acumen, that his arms seem almost too long.
Too long.
Do you know why, Glenn? His shoulders have been dislocated. He's asked to carry the patibulum. That's the cross beam. So I want to correct people. He's not carrying the whole cross. That would have been like 300 pounds.
Correct.
He's asked to carry the patibulum, just the cross beam. And he might have been chained to other criminals in this processional that goes outside of the city. He falls, he collapses, and it leads to more abrasions on his shoulders. And so on the back, do you see all the abrasions? Those are from when not just he falls and he drops the cross beam, that's when we believe that his shoulders were dislocated. He hangs on the cross, his shoulders are dislocated, and that's why his arms are elongated in rigor mortis.
Oh my gosh. Let's talk about what we can learn about crucifixion from this. Was it normal to be this brutalized?
No, this is fascinating. And it's kind of odd to say that I'm an expert in Roman crucifixion, but that's one of my areas of expertise. And Jesus dies in a particularly demonic, shameful, heinous way.
Yeah.
He's brutalized as he goes to the cross. And we've brought some crucifixion elements
So
here.
let's bring these
Glenn.
up here. So you have the scourge, the spear, the nails, the crown of thorns, which
Yes,
is
be careful because
just horrifying.
These are actual Bethlehem thorns, and they're like nails. So often, we'll start with the crown of thorns. When we look at art, we believe that Jesus is wearing some kind of sweatband or wreath.
Yeah, right.
You know, a
Yeah.
cutesy little
Like a
crown of thorns.
yeah, laurel.
Well, we know that he's being mocked. We know that as he's led to the cross, he's completely naked. But he's not totally naked because they fashion a crown of thorns, really, though, a helmet of thorns, a dome, a cap of thorns, and that is pressed into his head. And we know that there are 30 to 50 puncture wounds in the head of the crucified man. We know of only one person from antiquity. We have thousands of crucifixion victims explained, both in the Roman annals, Tacitus, others, Suetonius. We have no mention of a crown of thorns except in one particular case, the man who said, "I'm the king of the Jews." And they fashion a crown of thorns, a helmet of thorns. And one of the applications for me is we live in a time of such despair, such agony, so much anxiety, and we often wonder if God really loves us. When I think about the crown of thorns, when I stare at this, Glenn, and I think about it, I think about that passage that Saul of Tarsus wrote in Romans 5:8. But God demonstrated his love for us, and that while we were his enemies, we were his sinners, he sent Christ to die for us. And that reminds me of the lengths that Jesus would go. What we see in the crown of thorns is love in its most radical form. And it gives us pause, and we say, well, that should have been my head in that crown. It should have been my hands in these nails. It should have been my back with the flagrum.
I don't think people understand the crown of thorns until you see the thorns that came from Jerusalem at the time.
Correct.
It is horrifying, absolutely horrifying. This is what was used against him. Was it this short? Were they that close?
Yes, and these men were experts in execution. They were men. We know that there were probably two whipping Jesus. We've counted 372 wounds from scourge marks. Now you can see that has 3 cords on it and 2 lead balls. Some
On
have
each
thought
cord.
bone. So with each lash, you're getting 6 lashes in when you count up the balls. We know that he's lashed 372 times, but keep in mind, we don't have the lateral sides on the image. This is a 2D
Yeah.
image.
Right.
So I estimate,
There's got to be more on the sides than there were.
correct,
Yeah.
700 wounds that Jesus, the man of the shroud, endured for us from that flagrum, the scourging. And so that was particularly heinous.
And that happened on other crucifixions?
Absolutely.
It did.
It did happen. Often crucifixion victims wouldn't even make it to the cross. But again, it seemed that Jesus was brutalized under the reign of Pontius Pilate, who would ultimately get on the outs with Tiberius and die by suicide, interestingly enough. And so that's the flagrum. Glenn, I want you to hold the nails. We know a lot about nails from the archaeology.
These are just horrifying. And most people have the nails going
Right.
through his palm, but it would have ripped
Right
all
through.
that weight would have ripped right
It
through.
would have lacerated right through.
So it was actually put right
Perfectly.
in the wrist.
Again, this wasn't the first rodeo, as we say in
Right.
Texas, of these executioners.
Right.
They know that Jesus, they knew exactly where to puncture at the exact angle through the wrists into the hands, and it would foist his body weight of around 170 to 180 pounds. And they crushed his wrist when they did that, and they nail him to the cross. Keep in mind, his shoulders are already separated. The nails go through the wrists. It's the same Greek word for you scripture scholars out there, hands and wrists in the Greek Bible. And we see the nails are 9 inches long. Now, what's fascinating is crucifixion nails become something like a rabbit's foot then in Judaism of the late Second Temple period. We actually have a Roman crucifixion victim under the reign of Pontius Pilate, who is crucified, and he's given proper burial. Notice I said the word proper, not honorable. So he's a crucified victim, the worst way to die ever in the ancient world, and yet he's still allowed to be buried. And you can look this up. It's the heel bone of Yehohanan, because his heel bone still has the crucifixion nail in it.
Wow.
He had to be buried before nightfall, and this is again in the 20s AD, under the reign of Pontius Pilate. How do we know his name? Because of second burial. A year after a Jewish man died, his bones would be collected, and then ossulegium, a process of second burial, would take place. So that's like when you go to the land of Israel, where I know you've been, and thank you for your support of Israel. You see all the bone boxes. Those are ossuaries. Those ossuaries are where you would put the bones that were collected 1 year after the date of death, usually by the eldest son.
Wow.
And so we have this great artifact where we see crucifixion nails in a crucified victim, because the skeptical scholars will claim that crucified victims were not given proper burials. So this isn't Jesus, this is a hoax.
Well, wait. But isn't that true to the fact? I mean, crucifixion was not only supposed to be horrifying for the person. We always see the crosses as these big, tall things.
Right.
They were actually closer to the
Correct.
ground.
Eye level.
Yeah, so when you're walking into the city, you're like, I don't want to do that.
Yes.
Right? And they were left there for a while for the dogs to eat. Correct?
In some cases,
In some
yes.
cases, but not all cases.
And again, remember, this is not a monolith. The Romans were excellent politicians. And everything I say is based on the evidence. What do we know in non-wartime? The only time that we know that Philo, a Jewish historian in Alexandria, Josephus, we know the biblical records tell us. So there's 6 amazing sources right there that Jews were allowed to bury their dead properly, even crucified victims. The only time that we know of where Jews were not allowed to bury their dead was during the revolt of 66 to 70 AD. My dear friend and colleague at Christian Thinkers, Craig Evans, has done phenomenal, groundbreaking work on this, that only in wartime were Jews not allowed to bury the dead and the dead of their crucified victims. Jesus dies in AD 33. There's no war going on, and the Jews were fine to give back the body. They were politicians. Yeah, go do that tradition. We're still in power.